What's with the pixel missing? Password. So what, back to Explorer or just...
Yeah, like to get that to work, I have to start it as something with admin rights and rejig it.
That's a really prompt. Ooh, I didn't find out actually last time. So there's just one you keep them in there, right? So everything else will work.
We can just jump out to YouTube if you want and find that video.
Oh, I love it. Oh, that's a good idea.
Just look up here.
Bing. So you go there, that's not going to disappear on music. Cool.
Oh, let's just leave it. It's not. I should have stopped it in the other meeting. It's really straightforward, right?
Yeah, no, I was just in a meeting too, and I was like, okay, I gotta go.
I can't do this.
10 to 5 or 10 to 4, it was like,
Okay. Please update the screen is not. Oh, wow. Okay, does that look alright? Yeah. Australian Rural Health Research Collaboration, is that alright? Yeah? Yeah, housekeeping? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it was really cold. And we have other sites? Yes? Other sites? Yeah, great. Huh? Yes, let's go. Okay, welcome everyone to our research seminar series, the first for this year. Well, what are we going to say? I'd like to welcome Shawn presenting today. He's an international renowned researcher in Indigenous research and is now working between Southern Cross University and UCRH. What do you say? I'm just going to keep on going because I think we may well run out of time. I also like to thank the Australian Rural Health Research Collaboration for funding these programs. Shawn will be presenting on conducting a research ceremony. Curiously enough, how to catch fish. Yeah. A couple of housekeeping things. The seminar hopefully will be recorded, and you need to tell me if you don't want to be recorded. And we said to please ask questions into the microphone so others can hear, but I think I need to update that to say that we actually have microphones in situ, so that doesn't apply. And recordings about the seminar series can be found on the Healthy North Coast website, and they're done in YouTube, so you can also probably find them on YouTube. We don't have the last seminar up yet, so I'm not quite sure of the time delays on that at the moment. Our next seminar will, also turn off your phones. I haven't done that yet. Our next seminar will be, instead of the last Thursday in the month, it will be 17th of March, and I think there's a Wednesday. And looking at chronic pain and physiotherapy with Shelley Barlow. Back to Shawn's presentation today. I'll turn it over to him. Thanks, everyone.
all right, thanks. My glasses are like, I'm getting old to have multifocal glasses, so it's like I can see you guys here fine. I can see like if I'm reading fine, but I can't see this distance in the middle. So I've got either. I'll take my glasses off to use the computer. I can, but there's just like a tiny little spot in the middle for computer distance. Okay, I'm going to use Prezi, which is like just another presentation software like PowerPoint. I like it better because it's weird. It's like me. So I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Benishon people, the land that we're meeting on, and also I'm not sure where everyone else is from, but acknowledge the traditional owners and knowledge keepers of the land where you guys are sitting in your off-site locations. So actually, while I'm following the protocols too, I guess I should mention who I work for. So I'm the Director of Research for the Guinea College of Indigenous Australian Peoples at Southern Cross University. And for the next month, I'm still working here at the University Centre for Rural Health and the University of Sydney Medical School. So those are the people that pay me to be here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Indigenous axiology and ethics, and why those are important for research. Because to me, they're quite important topics. All right, so I'm going to take you on hopefully a little bit of a journey around the whole idea of axiology and what that is, and ethics and research ethics and all that sort of stuff. Okay? So we'll start here. Bundjalung Nation. So all Bundjalung people are going to bugger off. Just grabbing something from my phone. So I just came back from a trip to Canada back home, and I was making this presentation there, so I had to start off with letting people know where I was coming from in Australia. So for you guys here, it's kind of old hat, you know, the Bundjalung Nation from the east coast of Australia, sort of. So that's where it is. That's the land where I live, work, and play, and so I've been welcomed by the elders to from there to do that. So I just wanted to talk about so coming from the Bundjalung Nation, how we go about doing research ethically, all right? So before you kind of start to think about what ethics actually are in doing research ethically, you have to sort of back up, I think, a step and think about, well, really when you're talking about research ethics, you're talking about how do you make value judgments, right? How do you make value judgments about your research? So you have to then say, well, what are value judgments in general? And so talking about axiology is starting to talk about things like what's good and bad and what's worth doing. So it's talking about worthiness of what's worth researching. It's also talking about evaluating things like who has done well, or when do you know you've done a good job. Okay, so all those sorts of things go into this sort of axiology, which is the study of morals, I guess, when you kind of call it that. Axioms, morals, okay? So those things, I do have my notes here. So when we're talking about axiology, we're talking about morals, ethics, and also assessment. How do you assess the value of things, right? So now, I think they just turned their lights off so they can see the screen better, probably. Are you guys down at that end? Can you see all right? I just noticed that you've turned your lights off. Is that just so you can see the screen better? I'm hoping you're okay.
Yes, we are. Yes.
Okay, cool. So that's what I wanted to look at a little bit. It's about this whole idea of ethics and morals and how you do assessment and that sort of stuff. So that's what axiology is for anyone. That's not unique for Indigenous people. But so what I want to talk a little bit about specifically then is, well, how does that apply in an Indigenous setting? And I think most of the time when I'm doing this sort of talk, it's like talking with other Indigenous people. So it's kind of like preaching to the choir, because it's like, oh yeah, that's what we always do. So hopefully, if you're already familiar with this, it's just sort of reinforcing what you already know or what your own elders have taught you. But for people, if this is sort of new stuff, just feel free to interrupt me anytime and ask questions and comments and stuff. So I'd prefer to have this more like a dialogue than having a diatribe. So I guess what I want to talk about is sort of some of the teachings that I've received from different elders, working with different researchers, Indigenous researchers around the world, around what an Indigenous axiology is. Okay? And I guess to me, the axiology is really important for Indigenous people, because I think it was Karen Martin, actually, who did one of these research seminars here about 4 or 5 years ago. One of the things she was saying was that it's when we're talking about Indigenous ways of doing things, we're talking about Indigenous ways of doing, Indigenous ways of knowing, but that we're not Indigenous doings, and we're not human doings, we're not human knowings, we're human beings. So really, axiology to me is about our way of being. So it's around how we go about being in the world. Okay, so Indigenous axiology is looking at sort of what sort of things we value in each other, or in other people and ourselves. It's also thinking about things like what do we find beautiful. Okay. And for Indigenous people, it's also really about how do we fulfill our roles in a relationship. So fulfilling your role in a relationship is a really important concept for judging your behavior. Okay? And I guess that there's a lot of different terms in different Indigenous languages that talk about axiology. And I think that for me, one of the ones that's really kind of a neat one that's in Sami language. The Sami are the Indigenous people in Northern Europe. So in Finland, Norway, and Sweden. There's a term in North Sami that's Duamersvorke, which basically translates to axiology. But what it means, if you sort of take a literal translation, it's beautiful. But if you have a more thorough look at what the word means, it also means it fulfills its role. So it's functional. So it has to do with beauty. It has to do with functionality. It has to do with all of those things that are tied together. So it's not just like pleasing to the eye, it also does what it's supposed to do. So you could say that this cup is beautiful, not just because it's aesthetically pleasing to the eye, but also it does a good job of holding its water for me. Right? So it's fulfilling its role in its relationship with me. So that's what part of what makes it beautiful. It's not just the eyeball thing. Okay, so that's, I think, starting to get a little bit at the sort of stuff I'm talking about. So it's talking about how we assess things, how we go about, how do we judge beautiful? How do we judge whether or not someone's fulfilling their role in a relationship? Okay? So for us as researchers, as academics, a lot of the time, what we're looking at for is, all right, for academics, how do you do peer review? That's a really important process for academics because we have to, part of our job is publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals, right? So how do you do peer review? Another part of peer review is also for academics, how do you apply for promotion? How do you apply for tenure? Who is it that's judging you when you apply for promotion and tenure? Is it actually your peers, which for Indigenous people it's usually not? Or is it a group of people from another discipline, another it's almost like, would you say if you were like in midwifery, would you expect an oncologist to judge whether you're doing a good job as a midwife? Probably not. So it's like most Indigenous researchers, there's not enough of us yet that we're actually getting peer reviewed as far as tenure promotion goes. It's usually people from other disciplines reviewing us because there's not enough of us to make that peer review process work. But I think that the peer review process itself is different for Indigenous people. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. Because to me, that's more exciting. And I think that that's part of, well, if you're talking about axiology, you're talking about morals and stuff like that. Well, how do you teach someone about morals? And most people teach, especially like when you're talking with kids, you teach them through telling a story, right? And like, well, what's the moral of the story? I guess that's where axioms come from, right? It's what's an axiom that's like has a story with a moral, right? So for Indigenous people, I think we take this a lot more seriously and carry it over into the modern day a lot more than mainstream people do. So I think storytelling is a really important function in teaching axiology and morals, not just to kids, but to everyone. And so oftentimes elders, when you're talking with elders, they'll tell you a lot of stories that carry a lot of morals. But our main point always is also that they usually don't tell you the moral of the story afterwards. They just leave that for you to figure out because the moral of the story is going to be a bit unique for each person that's listening to the story. Anyway, while I was working on this presentation before I went to Canada, I was typing away on my email and typing away on making this presentation, but you know how it is when you're making presentations, you get distracted by your email all the time. So that's what was happening with me. So I was working on this presentation, and I got this email that I'd won the Irish lottery. And so I don't know if that's ever happened to you guys, but that was pretty exciting. when you get 24 million pounds or whatever, I thought, oh, right, when I go to Canada, I'm going to be able to fly business class instead of having to sit at the back of the plane with all the smelly peasants. But I think that you guys all know that I didn't actually win the Irish lottery, right? Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be here right now. But what it was coyote. Now, coyote is an important trickster figure in a lot of Indigenous people's stories. And sort of the whole idea of having tricksters is not unique to Indigenous people, but it's quite common through a lot of different mythologies. Like if you start to look at, say, Norse mythology with Loki, or say in Europe, maybe it's more of someone like Pan, perhaps. So there's the whole idea of tricksters being there, that they teach you stories by doing things in the wrong way, or they teach you morals by deliberately do things wrong, sort of teach you a lesson, right? So basically, it was coyote that hacked into my email, and I was thinking about it afterwards, and it was like, oh yeah, well, what story is that teaching me, or what moral is that teaching me? And I said, oh shit, I know what it is. It's because I was on Ashley Madison, so that's how he broke into Ashley Madison. So if you don't know who Ashley Madison is, it may not mean anything for you. But anyway, so for me, I think that it's important to sort of think about, well, how does that work in a modern context, right? So I think I may have told some of you guys this story before, so I was thinking about, all right, well, there's a lot of different stories that we have that are like traditional stories, but we change them into a modern context. And then we also have like more old-fashioned type stories, right? So it's like I can use trickster stories and make them in a modern context. Coyote stories, talking about it being a hacker. But if I think of like a more old story, there's like the Cree version of the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Now, I don't know how many of you have already heard me tell the story, but the Cree story is quite a bit different than the English story. So Little Red Riding Hood is walking through the forest one day, and she's got her cedar basket of goodies that she's taking to her grandma's house. And as she's walking along, she comes across the big bad wolf. But the Cree Little Red Riding Hood's not actually a moron, so she recognizes that big bad wolf is actually a wolf. Not her grandma in disguise, right? So the first thing she says is, oh, big bad wolf, what great big bulgy eyes you have. Oh, big bad wolf, what a great big fierce teeth you have. Big bad wolf, what a fierce looking grimace you've got on your face. And the wolf, because that's back in the days when animals could talk to people, the wolf says to Big Red Riding Hood, get lost, kid, I'm taking a shit. So anyway, it's up to you to figure out what the moral of that story is for yourself, all right? You could use humor a lot of the times to teach morals as well. But I'll leave it up to you to figure that one out for yourself. But I think that it's important that we can think of we can have traditional stories, but we adapt to the modern context. We can use humor as a way of teaching just as well as we can use anything else. So I always think that, if you're talking about Anonymous, I always, the sort of famous hacker group, I always think that's just that's Coyote's modern disguise is Anonymous. So that if you look at Coyote, that's who's behind the Anonymous mask. So he's a trickster meant to teach people morals. Right? I feel like I'm talking too much already. Does anyone have any questions so far? Maybe a good point to stop for questions. Yeah? Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's exactly what the next point was. So what a good segue. And I didn't even pay her to ask that question. Okay, so I think that if we start to look at what judging things is part of judging them as how well do you fulfill your role, I think that for a lot of Indigenous people, there's a lot of freedom in that there's not supposed to be a whole lot of structures around telling people what they have to do. Rather, there's more structures around, this is what your role is in the community. We'll give you some training in the best way to fill that role, or in some ways to fill that role, but it's really up to you to decide how you're going to do it. So I think if you look at a lot more traditional Indigenous communities, there's, well, this is something that's totally changed today, is that there was not real specific role delineation. So it's like, you have to do this. And it was really not dogmatic, where because you were this person, you have to do this, 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 this. So there wasn't those sort of rules that were, I'm not really sure the right way to put this. Like, instead of, they were rules that were sort of general in nature. You have to fill this role, but they weren't specific in that they could be decontextualized and made universal. So that if you are a nurse, this is your role, and you do A, B, C, D, E, and F, G. If you're a researcher, these are the steps you have to follow. It was more like, as a researcher, you're there to help people learn new stuff. All right? So it's up to you to figure out how you do that, rather than following a set of guidelines that are really strict. So it's more about like helping people to develop their capacity. So training was a big part of it. But then it's up to individual people to figure out how they're going to apply that capacity in specific situations, and every situation is going to be different. Okay, so there's a recognition that different people have different abilities, and so they're going to fulfill their roles in different ways. Okay, does that make sense? I guess if I were to tell a story about that, I would say a story that was actually, it's a Cree story, but it was told to me by a guy in Australia whose grandmother is Cree, and he's Cree-Métis, but he sort of migrated to Australia about 10 years before I did, and I met him here. So it's like a story from back home, but one that got shared with me here. So that story is how should I start this story? A long time ago, back before, well, there was modern technology and stuff, but a long time ago, there was a bunch of guys in the community that wanted to learn how to hunt. Okay, so hunting is a really important skill. Okay, so for these guys, they're a bunch of young men, and young men are not really known for being very smart, right? They think with certain parts of their anatomy that are not really meant for thinking. So these young men thought, all right, we're going to go out and be hunters, right? We're going to learn how to hunt. But they are going to be they decided they weren't just going to just be regular old hunters. They were going to be really badass hunters, right? So they're going to be so good, they're going to put the local KFC out of business. So part of what they did, all right, okay, well, so what do we need to do to learn how to hunt? So, all right, so the first thing we need to do is learn how to shoot a bow and arrow. So they made some targets, and they made themselves bows and got a bunch of arrows. And they were really crappy, and couldn't even attach the arrow to the bow properly. And then after a couple of weeks, they're starting to get a little bit better at it. After a few more weeks, they're starting to hit their target most of the time. They're starting to develop the calluses that you need to shoot a bow. And calluses on your finger, and calluses on your arm from where the bowstring hits your arm. So they were building up the muscle memory that was required to shoot the bow. They're building up the muscles needed, and they're building up their skills in shooting bow and arrow. Right, so pretty soon they're getting pretty good at it, and they're hitting the bullseye just about every time they were out shooting a target. So then they thought, all right, so we're getting good at bow and arrow. Now what's the next thing we need to learn? So they thought, well, not very often that you're shooting at something that's just standing still. So maybe we need to learn how to shoot our bows and arrows while we're running. Shoot our arrows while we're running. So they started practicing running while they were shooting. So at first they were tripping all the time and still dropping their arrows. But after a couple of weeks, they were getting pretty good. So they could run along full speed, and then they can shoot their arrow and hit the target every time when they were running along full speed. Okay, so that was another skill that they learned, and they had down pats. All right, what's the next thing we need to learn? Well, actually, we need to learn how to run through the forest, but we need to be able to do it quietly, right? Because otherwise, if we just go blundering through the woods, every animal's going to hear us coming miles away. So they practiced their stealth attacks and running through the forest really quietly. So they were getting really good, so they could run through the forest really quiet, and they were like sneaking all over the place and sneaking through the forest, and they could run and jump out and shoot an arrow really fast and run really fast, and they're building up their stamina. Their body started to get in really good shape from all the running around that they were doing. Right? So they think, okay, now we've got the running part, we've got the stealth part down, we've got the shooting bows and arrows down really well. Oh, I guess we need to learn how to track some animals. So that's the next sort of thing they set out to do, is to learn how to track animals. So they studied, looked up on the internet how moose track looks, and they figured out how the tracks of the different animals and how they look, and how they could tell which direction the animal was heading and whether it's tired or whether it's wounded or not. So they started to learn all these things about tracking. So they were learning about their environment around them. They were learning about the different animals that they were trying to get. Pretty soon they got to be pretty good trackers, but they still hadn't caught anything. They still weren't successful hunters. So finally they figured out, maybe we should go and ask an elder what we should do. So that's the next thing they did. So they went and they took some tobacco and asked an elder, can you show us how to hunt? Now the elder that they asked was recognized in the community as a really good hunter, because he was always had food to share with the other elders. He always had food to share with the community, right? So whenever he went out hunting, he would always catch something, and he'd always bring it back and share it with everyone else. So the elder said, yeah, okay, I'll teach you how to hunt so you just come over to my place tomorrow and I'll take you out hunting. So they showed up, but knowing that the animals are usually most active at dawn, they showed up like a half an hour before dawn, and they were all gung-ho and raring to go. But the elder wasn't there yet. So they were waiting around. It was almost like noon by the time the elder came out and said, oh, you guys, what are you guys here for? And I said, oh, you were going to take us out hunting. And the elder says, oh, yeah, okay, you guys still want to go? And, yep. So, okay, let's go hunting. So the elder went back inside, and he got up this really ancient rifle and started setting off from his house downhill from his house towards the woods. But as they got to the woods, the young guys were noticing that the elder was just totally out of shape. So he's walking along, and he's like, you know how it is when you can't get your breath. They got to the woods, and he was tripping over tree roots and stumbling and crashing into things and making a hell of a racket. And the guys were like, okay, what's going on? This guy, how the hell is this guy going to get anything? So anyway, they kept following him along. He went a couple hundred meters into the bush, and finally they came to a clearing in the trees, and they were surprised that there was actually a deer there, because all the noise that they were making. So they saw the deer, and the young guys were all really excited. So they got ready to take off and chase after this deer, because they know how to run and shoot their bows at the same time, right? But of course, the deer, as soon as it saw them, it had its head up in its ears because it heard them coming a long way away. So it just took off. So they were going to go and chase down the deer, but the elder said, no, just wait. And there was a kind of a rock over in the clearing there. So the elder said to them, why don't you help me get up on that rock over there? So they put down their bows that they were getting ready to take off. They put down, and the elder went over and sat on that rock, and he took out his drum and he started drumming, and he started singing a song. And as he sang his song, slowly at first and quietly, and just kept going, after a little while, the deer came back and he kept singing his song, and then more and more deer started to come into the clearing. And he kept singing, and the does got behind and pushed out a young buck out into the front of the clearing, and young buck just stood there. So the elder put down his drum and took out his ancient rifle and just walked up and killed the buck that those who pushed forward. And he put down some tobacco and said a prayer of thanks. Okay. So that's one thing actually about most Indigenous stories. I'm not going to tell you the moral of that story. You can figure it out for yourself. But also, they're not necessarily like Western stories where they have like a defined beginning, a middle, an end, and an anticlimax. So because it's up to you to figure it out, you got to figure out how that fits into the rest of what I'm telling you, right? Okay. Anyway, but it's important, that story. So, but that, and how does that apply to research and how that applies to teaching is really crucial. How do we teach people about research? What skills do we teach? Anyway, that leads me sort of in an indirect way back towards where I'm from, is Pasquak Cree Nation. So that's right there. As you can see, it's in the center of the universe, in the middle of Canada. So that's where I come from, and that's where a lot of the teachings that I carry come from, because it's been through working with different elders there that taught me how to behave in the world, I suppose, and I carry those teachings through. That I guess part of what the different elders that I've worked with have always taught me is it's not necessarily, you don't teach people a bunch of rules, you teach them how to behave themselves, basically. So if I think about ethics and I think about morals and how to behave myself in research, I think there's probably three key words that are the philosophy behind how to behave myself when I'm doing research. And the first one is Pastahuin, which doesn't really have a English translation, but I suppose the closest translation would be natural law. But it's not really law in that it's like a set of codes of behavior. It's law more like in, I don't know how you put it, general guidelines rather than rules, right? So natural law, so Pastahuin. And that natural law, when you break natural law, has natural consequences. So I use sort of an example, like a natural law is like you don't stand up in a canoe, right? And the natural consequence of breaking that law is that someone's going to fall in the water. Okay, so that's the first sort of rule of behavior is you follow natural law. But if you don't follow natural law, there's going to be natural consequences. Much more serious rule of behavior is Ochinawin, and that means sacred law. Maybe it's closer to sacred lore than law. Okay, so and those are things that are more fundamental to our way of being. All right. Now, if I would say that the natural laws don't stand up in a canoe, or the natural consequences you're going to fall out, a more sacred law would be if you're out fishing, you have to respect the water. You have to respect the fish. If you disrespect water, there's going to be sacred consequences. And those consequences are not necessarily going to mean that you're going to run out of water or you're going to get thirsty. They're going to be long-term consequences that are going to happen to you or your children or your grandchildren or your great-great-grandchildren, right? So it's kind of like karma, but on a long-term scale, okay? So those are the two sort of rules of how you behave yourself. You follow sacred law and you follow natural law. But I think that, for me, an important concept is how do you do that? How do you follow those laws? Is through practicing something called Sagihiwewin. Sagihiwewin. So, and the sort of closest English translation to that is love in action. So when you start to, I don't know, that's just self-explanatory to me. It's like, so you just behave with love, okay? So the question then becomes, well, how do you practice love in action? In our modern context, it's quite difficult, right? Or how do you practice love in what you're doing as a researcher? So that's, again, a really tricky question. But for me, it's going to have really important consequences in what are going to be the implications of the research that you're doing. So if you're doing research that is constantly focusing on the negative, constantly, say, for example, focusing on, if we look at Aboriginal health, these are all the deficits that we have. You know, we've got high rates of diabetes, we've got high rates of suicide, we've got X, Y, we can list 500 things that are all the problems with Aboriginal health, right? But that's not really behaving with love interaction. That's not really following sacred law. That's looking at deficits. I would say a much more loving way to act is to think about what is it about Aboriginality that's a protective factor? Like, I mean, when we know all the negative shit that Aboriginal people have to go through on a day-to-day living, if they didn't have their Aboriginality as a shield to guide them, they would have died out a long time ago. Okay? So what it is it? There's something beautiful in different Indigenous cultures that allows Indigenous people to survive on to today. What is that? What is that beauty, and how can we share that beauty of Aboriginal culture with Aboriginal kids so that they can survive, and not just survive, but they can flourish? So to me, that's how you go about practicing love in action. What are some ways that Aboriginal people can flourish? Not just survive, but what will help us to flourish? That's how you practice love in action in research. Okay. That's the video that was missing. I'll show it to you in a second. But, actually, I'll show it to you now. Because it has to do with, so if you're practicing love in action, it's going to help you decide a whole lot of things. It's going to decide you how to do your research, but it's also going to help you to decide really basic things like who are you going to go fishing with? That's an important question, right? I'll think about that for a second. So I hope you guys at the different sites can see this little video. Okay. So, I don't know if I need to tell you the moral of the story behind that fishing story, or if you can figure it out for yourself. Yeah, well, you need to know the context, I suppose. That's the thing about. That's the problem that we have when we try to communicate cross-culturally, right? So, for Western people, they assume everyone's coming from the same cultural context as them, so they just go ahead and start talking about stuff. Right? So, for Aboriginal people that are in this situation, it's like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. So sometimes it's good for me to give you some stories that are like, you don't have the cultural context to interpret that, right? Recognize that maybe that's how Indigenous people are feeling when you're talking to them, and they don't have the cultural context to understand what you're talking about. So that's me catching a really big lake trout. But the important part about it is, who am I going to pick to go fishing with? And I'm not necessarily going to pick the best fishermen in the community, because I don't really need to fish for food. for me, the important part of going fishing is connecting with culture, connecting with my family. So I'm going to go fishing with my brother and my sister. So that was me out fishing with my brother and sister. And that is, for me, the important part of connecting with culture is that it's connecting with family. So it's like if you were to put that into a health context, it's like if you go and visit with an elder and they, give you some damper with jam on it and some tea with sugar in it. It's like technically in your brain that white flour, sugar, jam, they're all contributing to extremely high rates of diabetes amongst Aboriginal people, right? But you also recognize that elder sharing those things with you is nourishing your soul. It's feeding your spirit. That's their way of sharing with you. So that's way more important for most Aboriginal people than thinking about whether or not they're going to get diabetes from eating white flour. It's if an elder is offering me some damper and jam, I'm not just going to eat it out of grudgingly because I know it's bad for my health. That's like the best food that could possibly be for me because it's feeding my spirit. It may be damaging my body, but it's doing way more benefit to my spirit than it is damaging my body. So if you start to think about how things work as far as practicing love and how you act, then I think it's a lot easier to understand how and why people make the decisions that they do. So they're deciding why to do things based on love and making connections with people, not necessarily just purely on what's best for my physical health. Right? Anyway, that's one interpretation of that. There's lots more. Okay? But I kind of gave you guys the abbreviated version of that because I was hoping you'd answer lots of questions. So, did anyone have any more questions? Or any stories that you want to share? Well, I think just as a general concept, my focus in research, I always try to maintain it on positive instead of the negative. So, because I do a lot of mental health research, it's not what are the problems with mental health. Say if I'm going to do research on racism, I'm not going to do research on racism. I'm going to do research on how do you make people behave in a more loving fashion, rather than what's making people racist. So it's like whatever problem that you look at, usually there's a healthy alternative. So I would say if you have the chance, research the healthy alternative rather than the negative. So for example, when I was doing my PhD, what I started out looking at was, I already had that in mind, but I was looking at, started looking at how can Aboriginal people be successful at university but still maintain their culture. So be successful in the mainstream university and still be successful in their culture. But when I started doing my research, I found that a lot of people were saying that that there were certain things that were holding them back. And they directed me, the people that I was doing my research with, directed me to say, well, rather than looking at what is it that's allowing you to be successful in both worlds, they were saying, why don't you, it would be more helpful for us if you would better articulate what Indigenous research means and what Indigenous research paradigm is. Because that's what's holding us back from being successful in both. Because mainstream people don't understand how Indigenous research works. So we're constantly having to use Western methods. So if you could better articulate what Indigenous methodology is, it would help us bring that part of us into the academy. So that's what my doctoral research shifted focus to look more at Indigenous philosophies and how we can apply that in research. through things like storytelling. The problem is it's like a lot of Western people aren't willing to yet recognize that there are lessons to be gained from stories. That's just as an important way of transmitting information as writing a peer-reviewed journal article. Yeah, and it didn't used to be that way, right? Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Shift the focus to the resilience, yeah, instead of all the problems. Like, and you still recognize, I guess, that all those problems are still there, right? It's not denying the problems. It's not, putting on rose-colored glasses and saying there's no problem. What it is doing is saying, yeah, those problems are there, but this is a way forward. This is a way out. Right? Mm. Yeah. It's easy. Just use it. Just use it. The hardest part is justifying it. The hard part's not doing it. Doing it's the easy part. But unfortunately, part of what you have to do when you're doing your PhD is to justify why you're doing what you're doing. So that's the hard part. But it becomes easier all the time as more and more Indigenous people are doing research and writing it up, that you have precedent to build upon. So you've got, this is how this person did it, this is how this person did it, this is how this person did it. There's still a small fraction of the overall research that's done on Indigenous people, on Indigenous people. It's starting to look at, there's just still a small fraction that's done by Indigenous people or with Indigenous people rather than on them. And that's a big difference, right? But we can start to build on that small fraction and make things better. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah. But it's, yeah. Yeah. It's funny, but at the same time, like there's, I don't know what it is, but there's this real tendency in Western science to make these sharp delineations between, their separation of church and state, separation of the academy from practice, separation of emotion from intellect, which doesn't need to be there. And yeah. But that get built even within people themselves, right? So it's not just between institutions, it's within the person. So you're not allowed to consider your emotions when you're thinking about something that's supposed to be rational, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, you can't. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think I think that most non-Indigenous people recognize the same thing. It's like, how can you do social work without being a loving person? It's like, how could you be a nurse without being loving? How could you be a doctor? How could you do what we do in health and whatever without being loving? It's like, you can't. You wouldn't do it. Yeah, yeah. 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 Yeah, it's almost like there's like when you're justifying your research, in Western research, you just have to justify your method. Really, you don't have to justify your whole underlying methodology, and you don't have to justify your whole underlying philosophy, which are all beneath that, right? It's all assumed that you're coming from a Western philosophy, that you're going to use certain methodologies. So therefore, you just have to justify the method. Whereas for Indigenous people, you've got to justify your whole philosophy and way of life, and then how that's going to relate to research, and then your method. So it's like the whole two more layers of justification. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the whole idea of reflexivity, I think, is really important too. It's like there's an extra layer of reflexivity there working cross-culturally, right? But I think that sort of Indigenous philosophy in general encourages reflexivity because there are no guidelines for behavior. There's overall guidelines, but there's no specific rules. So you can't go and do a checklist and say, I've done this, 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 and this. It's like you have to stop and think. There's no checklist to say, did you act in a loving manner? You can't. You have to stop and reflect on. Reflexivity is required, I guess. Was that loving? What was in my heart when I was doing that? Why did I act that way? So it's much more intrinsically part of Indigenous research is that reflexivity. And actually, that's another thing that I've changed my wording around to, that I try to use Indigenous research because it's naming a philosophy, and I'm not saying it's unique to Indigenous people, because a lot of non-Indigenous people follow that same philosophy, I think. That's not to say that a non-Indigenous person knows what the experience of an Indigenous person is, but you could still have that philosophy, though, but you're just applying it in a different context. All right. Oh, actually, I was going to ask if the people at the other sites had any questions. We've been hogging the conversation here. Oh, they're busy talking away. All right, well, maybe we'll call it quits because it's about time. Okay? So thank you all for coming and listening and talking. And, where my email addresses are somewhere, I think. if you want to contact me on my new email address. Oops. Yep. Oops, I've zoomed in too much. Anyway, it's Shawn.Wilson. There it is. At scu.edu.au. Thanks. Now it's starting to get really hot in here. I wasn't sure if it was just me being hot. No, good.
I'm going to send you all my papers.
Okay.
I haven't done any work on my last chapter. I haven't finished the first chapter. I don't want to see the introduction. I thought I'm not seeing it. I want it all at once.
Send it in chunks. It's fine. Just don't expect immediate feedback. But remind me every once in a while. If I'll put it on the back burner, but if you don't remind me, I'll leave it on.